Welcome back, everybody. I hope everybody's still connected and that the speakers are ready to reconvene with the second part of the webinar. We have the pleasure today to have two of our colleagues working at CIS, the Swedish Institute for Standards, which is a CEN member, and they're both working for the Secretariat of Working Group 1 of CEN-TC 151, working on machinery safety. So together with my colleague Joanna FRANKOWSKA, Project Manager Manufacturing, they will be presenting you how to draft a detailed informative Annex Set ZZ under the Machinery Directive. So please, Lisa, Sara and Joanna, the floor is yours. Yes, before we go into the presentations, I'm sorry I forgot, but we have prepared a little poll for you. So before they kick off with presenting the things they have prepared, I would like to ask the audience how well they know the essential health and safety requirements, the so-called EHSR of the Machinery Directive. So give me a moment to launch that poll. And then I invite everybody connected today to enter their answers in the poll. So do you know them a little bit? Do you have a good knowledge of the requirements, or do you know them almost by heart? Okay, it seems that the replies are more or less stable now. Let me end the poll and share right away the results with you, because then you can see that most of the people tell us that they have a good knowledge of the requirements, and the minor part of you know them by heart. So that's good, because if you know them a bit, then probably during the presentations that will follow, you will learn more about these. So please, ladies, I just stopped sharing the presentation, sorry, the poll. The presentation is still online, so please go ahead.
Good afternoon, everybody. So it's good to see that there's a good knowledge of the essential requirements among the participants. The topic of mine and my colleagues from CIS presentation is an informative Annex Z. It will consist of 4 parts. First, there will be some introductory general remarks. The second part will give more practical information. The third one will be dedicated to multi-part standards, and there will be some final remarks. For the purpose of this presentation, we'll use the term an informative Annex Z. In this way, we will cover the Annex ZA, as we call it in CEN, and as we call it Annex ZZ in CENELEC. Because in CENELEC, the term Annex ZA is reserved, dedicated to something else, is a normative annex on the normative references. What is an Annex Z? So this annex shows the correspondence between the requirements from the EU regulation and the clauses of the standards that aim to address these requirements. Where can you find these essential requirements? They are enlisted in the Annex 1 to the Machinery Directive. And if you are involved in the drafting of a harmonized standard under Machinery Directive, you really need to familiarize with this annex. You need to have it in front of you. This slide shows on the example of the concrete standard, how the correlation between the essential requirement and the clauses of the standard is made in practice in the informative Annex Z. So this example is relating to the essential requirement 1.7.1.2 on warning devices. And you can see that in the first column of the table, it is necessary to give the number of this essential requirement. So here it is 1.7.1.2, whereas in the second column of the table, you need to give the number of the clause or of the clauses, if there are more, or sub-clauses that address this particular essential requirement. So here it is the clause 4.7.1.1. And now I will give the floor to Sara. Over to you, Sara.
Thank you, Joanna. So the reason I and Lisa, we were invited to this webinar is that we, during the development of EN474, gained quite a lot of experience of drafting this detailed Annex Z of multi-part standards. So this multi-part standard dealing with safety of earth-moving machinery consists of 13 parts. And when the requirement of this detailed Annex Z came, it was quite late in the project, which meant that we started drafting the Annex Z when the standards were almost already completed. So for understandable reasons, this caused a bit of a stir, since we all realized that this would create quite a lot of work, which it did. However, once started, drafting the Annex Z turned out to be a really good exercise for the people involved, because it forced them to really carefully study each and every of the essential health and safety requirements in the Machinery Directive. And for example, we actually realized that there were requirements in the Machinery Directive that had not been covered by the standard. And it also became obvious how useful the Annex Z can be for the manufacturer. As we heard earlier in the presentation, individual standards are not obliged to cover all the essential health and safety requirements in the Machinery Directive. However, what is required is that it needs to be clearly stated in the Annex Z that those requirements are not covered by the standard, and consequently, the manufacturer needs to deal with those requirements by other means. So what we want to do here today is to share some of that experience in order for you to succeed with your drafting of detailed Annex Z in general, and for multi-part standards in particular. So next slide, please. There. So to start with, how to start. Know your Machinery Directive. There is really no way around it, and I can't stress this enough. The HAS consultants, they are experts of the Machinery Directive. They will notice if there are things missing, and they will notice if the clauses that you refer to don't actually give sufficient guidance on how to fully cover the requirements in the directive. Second, designate a group of people. It is necessary to designate a group of people that keep the Annex Z in mind throughout the project. 4, 6, or 8 eyes see more than 2. Quite often it's not a straightforward work to do this Annex Z drafting, and it helps to discuss things amongst a group of people. Start with the Annex Z at the very early stage of the project, or already at the very start of the project, really. You need to read through very carefully each and every essential health and safety requirement in the Machinery Directive. And for every requirement, you need to evaluate which requirements that are not relevant, which requirements that are relevant but will not be covered in the standard, and which requirements that are relevant and will be covered by the standard. And you shall keep that in mind when drafting the overall structure of the standard. And make notes of your reasoning for every requirement. It will help you remember later, maybe when trying to explain something for the HAS consultants later. Next slide, please. So as I told you before, when we started drafting the Annex Set, we had almost already completed the drafting of the actual standards. This is not to be recommended. On the contrary, we highly recommend that you work in parallel throughout the project with drafting the clauses, obviously. The Annex Z, always keep Annex Z in mind when drafting the standard. The list of significant hazards, which we heard about before, valid only for safety standard according to CEN Guide 414. And also the verification of the safety requirements and or the protective risk reduction measures. And those are also only valid for safety standards. So next slide, please. And last but not least, it is very important that you use the correct template for the Annex Set. So I think you should make it a good habit to download it directly from CEN and CENELEC BOSS in order to make sure that you are using the latest version. Next slide, please. So about the actual drafting of the Annex Z. So this is a piece that you can see of the template of the Annex Z. And as you see at the top there, it is the relevant essential requirement that shall be indicated in the first column of Annex Z of type B and type C standards. In other words, essential requirements in the machinery directive that are not relevant for this standard or this particular type of machine shall not be mentioned in the Annex Set at all. Just leave it out. In the second column, all clauses of the standard that deal with this particular requirement shall be listed. And as for the third column, this should not be used for miscellaneous, nice to have information. What goes into that column is very restricted. For example, relevant essential requirements that are not covered by the standard needs to be addressed as not covered. In that way, it becomes very clear for everyone that a relevant requirement in the machinery directive is not covered by this standard and consequently needs to be dealt with by other means. However, this is only valid for type C standards. Type B standards that typically only deal with one or maybe a few of the essential health and safety requirements do not need to list all the relevant requirements that are not covered. So next slide, please. So as Dr. Steiger told you earlier, he mentioned this Excel-based tool developed by VDMA, which is the Mechanical Engineer Industry Association in Germany. They produced this tool to facilitate the drafting of the Annex Z. And what it does is basically to list all the essential health and safety requirements of the machinery directive in the first and second column. What you need to do is to list all the clauses in the standard dealing with that specific requirement in column F. In column G, all applicable requirements, which in this case is the same thing as all the relevant requirements, shall be marked with an X. That X means the specific requirement will be added in a generated Excel table that can be easily pasted into the Annex Z template. So if a relevant requirement is not covered by the standard, it shall be addressed as not covered, and that will also show up then in the Excel table. We mentioned this before, Dr. Steiger mentioned this before as well, but as you can see, column C, D, and E show the correlation between the essential health and safety requirements and the significant hazards as specified in CEN Guide 414. And here I want to highlight that for the significant hazard and the essential health and safety requirements, sometimes there is not a one-to-one correlation. And remember, this Excel tool is just that. It is a tool. You need to do the actual work. And as stated before, you need to read the actual requirements in the machinery directive. Reading only the headings in this Excel tool is not sufficient, and it will result in a mismatch between the requirements and the clauses in the standard. Next slide, please. So this slide is about granularity, or in other words, how detailed the Annex Set needs to be. I know that this is a very heavy slide and it is not very fun to look at, but we thought it was necessary to have it in the presentation nonetheless. So I'll just read it to you. So all the relevant essential health and safety requirements having a number, except 111, 311, and 411, which contain definitions, should be referred. Assume that all the subparts under these requirements are covered. Reference to subparts of numbered essential health and safety requirements, that is subclauses starting with a letter, indent, or without any marking, is not required. As always, there are exceptions. In this case, it's clause 112, for which we have a complete slide later in the presentation. Joanna will tell you more about it. It is acceptable to cover all number sub-requirements of a main requirement by making reference to the main requirement only. So for example, 121, 122, and 123 can be referenced as 1-2 control system. It is not accepted to make reference to the entire section 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. So type C standards should reference the particular normative clauses or annexes which address an individual requirement. It is acceptable to cover all subclauses of a main clause by making reference to the main clause only. And for type B standards, which normally addressing only one or very few essential health and safety requirements, it is acceptable to refer to particular normative clauses or annexes at the highest clause numbering level only. And this is not all black and white. Sometimes referring to a main clause is sufficient, and sometimes referring to a particular subclause, it's better. But some common sense should be used here, I think. So I think that was my last slide. So over to you, Joanna.
Thank you, Sara. So with this slide, I would like to highlight the importance of giving an accurate mapping between the essential requirements and the clauses of the standard. What you can see on the screen is the extract from the rejection letter from the European Commission, rejection of the citation of some standards. And you can see that inaccurate mapping was the reason for non-citation. So it's important to double check the correctness of the mapping before the draft standard is submitted to the procedures to inquiry or formal vote. Another important point that was the topic of Mikhai's presentation is that in the informative Annex Z, you can refer only to these clauses that deal with specific verifiable requirements. And in case it is not the case, you need to state not covered in the third column of the table. With the next two slides, I would like to explain how to address the essential requirement 1.1.2 on principles of safety integration. It is a specific essential requirement, a kind of introductory one that is then detailed down in further essential requirements. So we received the requests from the technical bodies and from the consultants how to deal with this essential requirement. And we believe that it is necessary to install some alignment of practices regarding this. So what we did, we discussed this matter with the European Commission in the framework of the CEN-CENELEC Sector Forum on Machinery, and we agreed on how to cover it. So first of all, what is different to all other essential requirements, here you need to refer to the indents, to the letters. That is the first point. However, it's important to not refer to the letter B. This one covers procedural aspects. It's about risk assessment. Therefore, it should not be referred to in the first column of the table. Then another important point is that in the second column, dedicated to the clauses, it is necessary to indicate the main numbers of these clauses that deal with safety requirements, protective risk reduction measures, verification of these, and information for use. Most usually, this will be the clauses number 4, 5, or 6, but check how it is done in your standard, because this can be also sometimes different numbers. Then another point, for the letter D and E of this essential requirement, check whether they are relevant for your standard, and if yes, then again in the second column you need to indicate the main clauses that deal with these topics that I explained earlier. And here on this slide you can see the correct example of the application of this arrangement. And now I would like to give the floor to Lisa.
Thank you, Joanna. Next slide. We will provide you with some do's and don'ts based on our own experience and from the experience from other non-conformity assessments. Please use the correct template and make sure you do not change the columns around or add text to it. And to make sure you are using the correct template, go to the source, like Sara showed you on the link on the BOSS site. When you are writing an amendment for a standard, please note that you need to update the entire Annex Z, not only focusing on the amended parts of your standard. And this is especially important when amending a standard that used the sort of old way of writing an annex, where you did not need to be as detailed as before. So when it was okay to basically write all normative clauses in the second column of the annex. And coming back to what both Joanna and Sara has been saying, it is really important that you match your EHSRs correctly with the clause of your standard that is dealing with that safety requirement. It's not sufficient to just read the title of the EHSR. Use the correct granularity both in the first and the second column, and that is when referring to the EHSR and when you are referencing the clauses in your standard. So be specific, but if all subclauses, for instance, deal with an essential health EHSR, it's okay to merge them when referencing. And make a final check of your mapping before submitting your draft to be assessed, so that clauses have not changed places, been removed or added. When referring to clauses of your standard, don't indicate clause 1, which is the scope of your standard, or the list of significant hazards that you have in your standard, either as a clause or an annex. When writing your EHSRs, please do not include 111, 311, or 411, as they only deal with definitions. They are not requirements as such. And make sure not to include references to other standards or legislations in your Annex Z. Annex Z is an informative annex, and it cannot be used to establish a relationship between your standard and other documents. If you need such a link, it needs to be provided via normative references in the normative part of your standards. So recapping to what Sara was saying, don't just add a lot of text in the remark and notes. Continuing on, in the CEN Guide 414 that Dr. Steiger spoke about previously, it is suggested that you refer to EN ISO 12100 on how to handle the relevant but not significant hazards that are not dealt with in your standard, as shown on the example of the screen. However, the clause suggesting this should not be referred to in Annex Z, since it's not specific or verifiable. And as a last don't, in your Annex Z, you are not to refer to a subclause of your standard that deals with aspects that are outside of the harmonization aspects of the Machinery Directive. So if you want to add requirements in your standard that are not needed by the Machinery Directive, please make them into a separate subclause and do not add them in your annex. And the reason here is that Annex Z is only to show conformity to a specific directive, and in this context, the Machinery Directive, not any other requirements as such.
Thank you very much, Lisa, as well as Sara and Joanna for this overview. We would like to drop another question for the audience, just asking you, when do you think that you should start working on the informative Annex ZZ? Let me launch the poll right away. So do you think that is from the beginning of the work on the harmonized standards, somewhere in the middle on the work on the harmonized standards, completely at the end, or are you not involved in the work on harmonized standards and you do not really know the answer? Okay, the answer continue coming in. Just a few more seconds for you to enter your answer, but it seems clear that most of the persons connected today think that it's from the beginning of the work on harmonized standards. So let me close the poll and share the results with you so that everybody can see them. There you go.
So thank you. It seems that we are in agreement on when a good way of starting. So moving on the part of our presentation dealing with multi-part standards. So firstly, I'll start with an explanation of what a multi-part standard is for those of you who are not familiar with the concept. A multi-part standard is where you have a part 1 that gives general and common specifications. Then you have other parts that provide specific requirements for a particular category of machinery by supplementing or modifying the requirements from part 1. And during this presentation, you will hear me say part X, machine-specific part, or machine-specific standard, where I mean the same thing. The parts of the standard series coming after part 1. There is an instruction on multi-part standards that was agreed upon with the Commission in the framework on the CEN-CENELEC sector for machinery in January 2020 that has been made available to all TCs within from the CCM project managers. That instruction deals not only with Annex Set, but also on other aspects of multi-part standards. So I encourage those so inclined to read the instruction. This presentation, however, will only be on how to handle Annex Z for multi-part standards. And the machine-specific standards will address 3 different situations. Firstly, it will give supplemented requirements to Part 1. Secondly, it will address if there are any requirements from Part 1 that are not applicable for your specific part. And thirdly, it will also add additional technical measures that are not addressed in Part 1. And one crucial aspect here is that Part 1 and the machine-specific part must always be used in combination. Part 1 alone cannot provide presumption of conformity. So therefore, in Annex Z of Part 1, a general remark or note shall be included in the 3rd column of the table as shown on the screen. And this is how we link Part 1 to the specific part. And please note that there is a 2nd edition of the instruction coming out soon, where the note will be changed somewhat editorially. I will speak about that a little bit later. But for now, you are to use the exact wording as of the note as shown on the screen. So like I mentioned in the beginning, there are 3 situations addressed in the Part X. And here I show you the where a requirement from Part 1 is modified. So in Annex Z of your machine-specific part, you will refer to the clause where the modification has been made. So in this example, in this machine-specific part, we are in clause 4.2, adding the modification. And please note that the clauses of Part 1 should not be indicated in Annex Z of Part X. In the 2nd column of your table, you are only to refer to clauses in the actual document. The 2nd situation is where a requirement from Part 1 is not applicable for your specific part. In the body text of your standard, you will write down this exclusion, and in Annex Z of Part X, you will refer to the clause where you make this exclusion, and then add a remark stating not applicable for the type of machinery in the scope. And same issue here, as I mentioned before, you are not to indicate the clauses of Part 1 in your Annex Z of the Part X. And the 3rd situation is where you have additional technical measures that have not been addressed in Part 1. So where an essential requirement was not relevant for the group of machines, but is relevant for your machine-specific part, you will then add a row with the essential health and safety requirement not handled in Part 1 in Annex Z of your specific part, and write down the references to the clauses dealing with that EHSR on your specific part as shown on the screen, yet again with an example. And like I mentioned before, there is an update coming soon on the instruction on multi-part standards. And the updated version of the instruction will clarify how to handle the case where there are no modification to the requirements from Part 1. For instance, if you have requirements related to fuel tanks in Part 1 that are to be applied without any changes in your specific part. And the 2nd edition will also make a limited number of editorial changes to the notes remarks that I showed previously that you are used to in Annex Set to link Part 1 and Part X. And once finalized and approved, this new edition of the instruction will be provided by CCMC to the TCs.
Thank you very much, Lisa. So now we are moving to the last fourth part of the presentation. And I would like to emphasize the main points. First of all, again, use the official template for an informative Annex Z from the dedicated CEN or CENELEC website instead of reusing the annex from the previous version of the standard, because it can be no longer up to date in line with the current rules. Then secondly, provide a good accurate mapping between the essential requirements and the clauses of the standard, and double check this mapping before the standard is submitted to the procedures. Thirdly, only refer to these essential requirements in an Annex Z that are relevant. So don't list all essential requirements from the Machinery Directive, but only the ones that are relevant, and if applicable, state not covered in the third column. Next point, when you develop an amendment, it's important, very important to know that you will need to review the Annex Z of the main standard, and in case something in this annex is no longer in line with the current rules, you will need to adapt it. Then another point, again, don't refer to the other standards or to the legislation in the table of the Annex Z, as this will most likely be the reason of non-citation of a standard. And then finally, follow the instructions that were agreed in the framework of the CEN-CENELEC Sector Forum on Machinery, and which were provided to you by CEN-CENELEC via the TC secretariats. And at the end, I would like to give you the list of the links to the useful material and documents useful for the purpose of the drafting of an informative Annex Z. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Joanna. I would like to launch another poll for the audience. Well, a few polls, in fact. The first question is in relation to the listing. So we would like to know if it's necessary to list in the first column of an Annex Z, AEZZ, all the requirements of the Machinery Directive. Just give me a moment to pick the poll. So do you think it is necessary? Sorry, do you think, yes, it is necessary that all requirements of the Machinery Directive are listed, or no, it is correct to list only these requirements, which are, I'm sorry, I cannot see the complete reply, but please let me know what you think is the correct answer so that the speakers have an idea of what you think. Okay, the results are stable. A minority thinks that all of the requirements should be listed. So let me end the poll and share it with you so that you can see it as well. I don't know if you want to add something to this, Joanna. Hello? No? Okay. And let's go to
I can just add in here then. I was actually planning to answer one question in the question and answers regarding this particular question. So the correct answer is no, it is correct to list only these essential health and safety requirements that are relevant for the product in the scope. And there was a question, who determines what is a relevant requirement in the Machinery Directive. And yes, it is the TC or the working group that decides what is relevant, a relevant requirement for this type of machinery. Of course, it can probably be challenged by the HAS consultant if you think that this requirement isn't relevant, and then the HAS consultant might ask you why it's not. Then you need to have an answer, obviously. So, but yes, it is the TC that decides. So good to see that you picked that up from the presentations, that it's only the relevant requirements. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Let me launch the next poll. I think it's also on the next slide. So the question is it allowed to indicate the references of other standards like TR, so technical reports or technical specifications in the third column of an Annex Set A? So please, the vote is open. And your question, is it yes, it is allowed, or no, because the European Commission will not cite such standards anyway? Okay, let me close the poll now. Interesting, because apparently the majority of you thinks it is not allowed. Can someone comment on this, please?
Yes, we are very proud of you, but no, you should not make any other references to standards or other sort of legal documents. Only talk about the standard, the document where you are.
Exactly. Thank you very much, Lisa. One more poll to go. I think that's the last one for today during this webinar. We would like to know, does the dedicated Excel tool from VDMA will create a final fully fledged Annex A or ZZ? Is the answer yes, it will, or no, the tool only helps in drafting of the initial annex? Okay, again, the voting the people seems to agree with this, that it's the answer is no, it does not create a final fully fledged Annex A or ZZ.
Yes, and I can comment that as well. So it's you're very good listeners, and I would just like to give you a tip from the Q&A list from Annette Wester-Udbratt, who's involved in the robotics section, where she gives you a very relevant tip that when they developed the Annex ZA for their safety standards, they added all text from the Machinery Directive in the Excel file and cut the different requirements into pieces, one at each row in the worksheet. And this made it easier for them to work and to compare that they had covered all relevant EHSRs. So that's a good tip if you want to be that detailed when working on it.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Annette, as well, for commenting on this. Are there any other questions that you would like to comment on? Please feel free to indicate one or more so that we treat these right away. If not, we can continue with the presentation. I'm just going to check the timing. Yeah, we have like 5 more minutes to handle some questions if you want to. No? Okay, well, then I suggest that we continue with the last part of these presentations. If you can go also to the next slide, please, Joanna. Because I think our colleague Nuno is sitting at the top of his chair to present his part. Yes, there is. Nuno is account manager manufacturing at CEN-CENELEC, and he will be presenting dating of normative references on the harmonized standards. So please, Nuno, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Els, and good afternoon, everyone. If it's okay, I will take control of the screen so I can change the slides myself.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, just 1 second because my computer was blocking. Can you please confirm that you can see the slides?
Yes, I can see it.
Thank you very much. So exactly. So the goal of this presentation is to give you some guidance on the use of normative references in Harmonized standards. And this is the structure of the presentation. So first, I will start with some basic rules on normative references. Then I will give you some guidance on the use of normative references in Harmonized standards, considering the Commission requirements. And then I will touch upon the checklist for Harmonized standards, which is linked with normative references, but it's much broader than that. And we thought it would be useful to bring this to the webinar today. So starting with basic rules on normative references. So the CEN-CENELEC internal regulations part 3 provides general rules for the drafting of CEN and CENELEC documents, and therefore it also includes particular rules for the use of normative references. So the IR3 is available on the CEN and CENELEC BOSS websites. The latest version we have is from June 2019, and we are currently preparing a revision of the IR3. If you have doubts, of course, you should download this document in order to better understand the drafting rules. And in particular, the normative references are very useful because it allows the use of already established provisions rather than developing new ones. And this will also help to reduce the risk of error, shorten the length of the document that you are writing, and avoid duplication. So the internal regulations part 3 clause 15 provides some rules on the clause of normative references, which is clause 2. So according to the definition, this clause lists the deliverables which are cited in the body of the standard in such a way that some or all of its content constitutes requirements of the document. So this comes from internal regulations part 3. Another important element is that clause 2 is mandatory. Even if there are no normative references in the body of the standard, you still have to include clause 2. However, it is an informative element. It provides information to the user of the standard on which normative references have been used in the standard, in the body of the standard. So the clause 2 cannot be subdivided, so you cannot have 2.1 and 2.2, for instance. And looking at clause 15 of IR3, it also indicates what is the standard text that you need to use at the beginning of clause 2. And you have here the two possible cases, but I will move to the next one. So clause 10 of IR3 indicates what are the permitted references. And I would say that as a general rule, normative references should be documents that are published by CEN, CENELEC, ISO, and IEC. So they are the recognized standardization organizations. Exceptionally, CEN and CENELEC draft standards that arrived at least to the inquiry stage, like the PRENs or even FPRENs at formal vote, could be used, but it's not really recommended because at the publication of the standard, you need to ensure that these normative references are already a sort of stable document. Other documents can be also used under certain conditions. For example, if they are recognized by the TC as having a very good acceptance, if the authors and publishers of that reference agrees with its inclusion as a normative reference in the document, and also the authors agree to come back to the TC when this reference is being revised or amendment, and the document must be available under commercial terms that are fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory. Clause 10 of IR3 also indicates what are the references that are not allowed. So here there is a list of documents to be avoided as much as possible. The first one is obviously normative references that are not publicly available. Normative references should not be EU legislation like the machinery directive, so this is also not allowed. If a document is just referred in the text of the standard for information, this is not a normative reference, eventually could be included in the clause of bibliography at the end of the document. And again, CEN and CENELEC standards that have not arrived yet to the inquiry stage cannot be a normative reference. So in other words, first working draft documents cannot be used as a normative reference in your document. Now, internal regulations part 3 allows the use of undated normative reference in standards. So these undated references are allowed when only referring to a complete document and when it is possible to use all the future changes of the reference document for the purposes of the referring document, and when the reference will include all amendments to and revisions of the reference document. So these three conditions must be met to use undated normative references. If a standard includes an undated normative references, it means that the whole document applies, all the amendments of the revisions will also apply. However, be very careful because the Commission have a strict view on undated normative references, and we will come back to that in the next slides. So Internal Regulation Part 3 also provides the conditions for dating normative references. So I would say that the default solution is to date the normative reference. Whenever a TC would like to undate the normative reference, and one of the three conditions that I presented in the slide before is not met, this means that the normative reference must be dated. Whenever in the body of the standard, the TC is referring to a specific clause of this normative reference, for example, a text or a figure, this means that the normative reference must be dated. And again, the dating is not only happening in clause 2, it must happen as well in the whole text of the standard. In fact, and this is important, in fact, it is the body of the standard that indicates whether the normative reference in clause 2 should be dated or not, and not the other way around. When a TC is revising a standard, what is important is to look at the list of normative references used in the standard and assess whether there is a need or not to update that reference, for example, if it's undated or if it is already withdrawn. So I suggest now to move, this was the basic rules on normative references for all standards. And now this part of the presentation will provide some guidance on normative references used in harmonized standards, again, taking into consideration the European Commission requirements. So the European Commission position on normative references is strict, much stricter than Internal Regulations Part 3. Following the EU court cases like the James Elliott and the Global Garden, the Commission have changed their internal processes on standardization, and also the Commission requirements on for citation of standards in the official journal. This means that the Commission position is that harmonized standards are part of a legal system, and therefore normative reference of those harmonized standards must be dated. So the Commission believes that undated normative references create a dynamic reference, which is very difficult for the Commission to control. So this means that, let's say there is an harmonized standard cited in the official journal that includes one undated normative reference. If in the future that undated normative reference is revised, the Commission do not have control whether that clause of the standard to which the normative reference is included still gives presumption of conformity or not. So in the eyes of the Commission, undated normative references, there is a risk of losing presumption of conformity. On this slide, you can see an overview of the critical findings leading to lack of compliance of standards in the under the Machinery Directive. So for the period is July 2020 to July 2021. A number of 196 standards have been assessed. And as you can see here, normative references is one of the reasons leading to lack of compliance. Maybe it's not the main one. Perhaps the main one would be Annex Set and some technical issues in the standard. But still, we can see that, for instance, 42 cases received out of 196 received lack of compliance, among other reasons, obviously, but because it contained undated normative references. So this topic is important, and it's why it is added to the webinar of today. When you are drafting harmonized standards and you wish to include a normative reference, you need to ask the question if the normative reference that will be included in clauses of the harmonized standard will or will not give presumption of conformity. If the answer is yes, this means that Internal Regulations Part 3 apply, but also the Commission requirements apply. If the answer is no, this means that only Internal Regulation Part 3 applies, and the TC can choose to date or not date that normative reference. However, if you want to increase the chances of citation in the official journal, my recommendation will be date all the normative references in your harmonized standard. So now in the next slides, I will present a number of practical tips to provide you some guidance on normative references in harmonized standards. The first one I kind of already touched upon is the tip number 1. So normative references should be dated not only in clause 2, but also in the text of your harmonized standards. So here on the left side, you have a typical clause 2 on normative references, where all the normative references have been correctly dated. They're all active and published. If you look at the example below of the same standard, you can see that they are also dated in the body of the standard. So this is a very good practice. On this slide, you can see an example of a Hath consultant comment indicating that the standard is basically compliant. The Annex Set was correctly prepared. However, the issue leading to lack of compliance of this particular standard was that clause 2 contained dated normative references, but the normative references were undated in the body of the standard. So this is just an example to remind you to date also in the body of the standard. And to finalize this tip 1, this is just an example of an harmonized standard to which some of the normative references were not dated, and therefore both in clause 2 and in the body of the standard, and the standard received a lack of compliance assessment by the consultant. Now, tip number 2, normative references, if they are included in clauses of the standard linked with requirements of the directive, and these clauses are supposed to give presumption of conformity, they should be dated, active, and published when the harmonized standard is adopted. And by adopted, we mean when the harmonized standard is published. So in other words, the Commission do not want to see harmonized standards that contain undated normative reference, withdrawn normative reference, and normative references that are draft standards at the moment that the harmonized standard is adopted. So the reference document for the European Commission in terms of guidance on normative references, but also other issues related with harmonized standards is the Vademecum. And the Vademecum is a Commission staff working document with guidance on standardization. And in section 2.8.3, it provides precise guidance on the use of normative references. And there is a strong recommendation that the normative references should be dated and published. So, and this message here on the slide is quite important to understand what I'm going to present in the next slides. Remember that following the Vademecum, the Commission would like that whenever an harmonized standard is published, so the DAV, all the normative references are active and published as well. So tip number 3 is it is possible to use draft standards like PRENs or FPRENs as normative references in harmonized standards, exceptionally, if they are being developed exactly at the same time, exactly at the same stage as a package, okay? So on the slides, you have one example. So I call it example 1, where there is harmonized standard, which is XYZ, that contains one normative reference, which is EN1234. And the message, and below here on the slide, you can see the development stages of a standard in general. So the important message I want to give you here is that if they are submitted exactly at the same time to either to CCMC, either to inquiry or to formal vote stage, and if the harmonized standard XYZ includes as normative reference FPREN 1234, these in principle should be acceptable. What happens is that after, let's imagine a perfect scenario where this harmonized standard receives a compliant assessment. After the formal vote stage, what happens is that the CCMC editor will transform that FPREN 1234 into, for example, EN 1234 with the date of publication. It could be, for example, 2021. And then the CCMC editor will go back to the technical committee to validate that change. And then both standards will be published at the same time with the correct dates of the normative references. So this is one example. Now, another tip, so this is tip number 4, pay particular attention when the normative reference and the harmonized standard are being developed at the same time but this time in different stages. So we have the same conditions. So this is example 2. The difference is that, as you can see here on the slide, as an example, the harmonized standard XYZ includes the normative reference 1, 2, 3, 4 that is being submitted to formal vote. And let's imagine that the normative reference date is, for instance, randomly 2012. That normative reference, PRN 1, 2, 3, 4, is also being revised at the same time, but in different stage. The inquiry is just starting for that normative reference. So in this case, the technical committee will have to assess how to tackle the normative reference date in the harmonized standard. There are some options on the table. Option 1 is to use the published normative reference in the harmonized standard, and this is acceptable. And option 2 is to wait for the normative reference to reach the formal vote stage and then submit both of them at the same time to formal vote. However, pay particular attention to option 2 because this will imply delaying the process, delaying the publication of the harmonized standard. So maybe is not the most preferable option, but you still have this option on the table if you want to proceed this way. With example 3, it's very similar to example 2, the same conditions, very similar to example 2. The difference is that the harmonized standard that includes the normative reference 1, 2, 3, 4 is being submitted to formal vote, and the normative reference 1, 2, 3, 4 is after the inquiry stage, is exactly in the middle of the stage handling of comments of the inquiry. So the gap between these two standards in terms of development time could be only 3 or 4 months. So you need to be very careful with that. Option 1 is that the technical committee will use the published normative reference in the harmonized standard, for example, EN 1234 from 2012. Option 2 is to wait for the normative reference to reach the stage of submitting the document to formal vote, so to align the development of the two documents and launch the formal vote together. And this means that the normative reference would be FPREN 1234 if we go with option 2, but option 1 is also fine if you want to include the current published version. However, with option 1, you need to be extremely careful. Remember, we are talking an harmonized standard, and this standard will undergo a Haas assessment that can be positive or negative. If the assessment is lack of compliance, this means that the formal vote will not be launched. The TC will have to address the comments from the consultant, and there is the risk that meanwhile the normative reference will be submitted to formal vote, and there is a risk that the normative reference will be published before the publication of your harmonized standard. So it's very important that you monitor the development of the normative reference if it's being developed at the same time. So this is the last example, example 4. So in this case, the harmonized standard is being submitted to formal vote, and the normative reference is already going through formal vote stage. So there are 3 options on the table. Option 1 is that you include in your harmonized standard the published version of the EN 1234, for example, version from 2012, but you know that at the moment that the harmonized standard is published, the normative reference will, or if you include a normative reference from 2012, meanwhile, it will be already withdrawn because you have a new version from for example, 2010 to 21. So you need to be very careful with option 1. So I would actually suggest not to go with option 1. With option 2 is that you can include in your harmonized standard the FPREN normative reference version, or option 3, you can wait for the publication of the normative reference and then submit the harmonized standard to CCMC for formal vote with the normative reference with the latest date of publication. So now it's tip number 5. Normative references should be published EN ISO IC standards because they are recognized standardization organizations in the view of the Commission. Exceptionally, under certain conditions, other documents could be used, but remember, internal regulations part 3 applies. You need a TC decision in the case of CEN, and in the case of CEN and CENELEC, you need always to provide a very detailed justification. And now this third point becomes quite tricky because when you submit a document to the Commission or to the Haas consultant for assessment, an harmonized standard, the consultant will also check the normative references. And remember that these non-EN ISO IC published standard would have to be provided to the consultant, and this is an issue also in terms of copyrights. So yeah, the recommendation would be, as much as possible, use EN ISO IC published standards. The Commission also informed me that national standards are seen, or is seen, the use of national standards as normative references is seen very negatively from the Commission point of view, because yeah, they are not international, they don't come from international organizations, and there is a lack of involvement from stakeholders from different regions, and this is an issue for the Commission. However, our advice is that if there is no other normative reference, or if there is no EN ISO IC published standard available, and there is only one national standard available for a specific clause, what we would, and you really want to use that, and you have a very good justification for that, I would advise that you contact the CCMC project manager that should get back to the Haas consultant and the European Commission to request and to ask whether it is possible to use that or not, and then we would wait for the feedback from the Commission on that. So this is just an example of a standard that received lack of compliance because included non-EN ISO IC published standards. So tip number 6 is for you to be very careful when you are using as normative references other harmonized standards in your harmonized standards. So in principle, if these harmonized standards are being developed at the same time as your harmonized standard, or they have been offered to the Commission for citation, but there is no result of assessment yet, in principle, those harmonized standards can be also normative references. What you cannot do is include harmonized standards as normative references in your harmonized standard that meanwhile have been rejected by the Commission for citation. And the same applies that if you include in your standard a normative reference that have been rejected and removed from the official journal because of a formal objection. Tip number 7 is for you to be very careful when you are drafting amendments of published harmonized standards. My recommendation is always that it's easier for a TC to revise the harmonized standard instead of amending it, because it avoids the risk of making some mistakes because some content was forgotten and not included in the amendment. So what is important in any case, if the TC decides to go with an amendment, is that you look at the list of normative references in the parent standard and you ensure if those normative references are updated so that they are not undated and they have not been withdrawn. If that's the case, what you need to do is just to include those corrections in your amendment. So on the right side, you have a very good example of an EN ISO amendment to which the TC has decided to completely replace the clause 2 to correct the normative references with the correct dates. Here on this slide, you have 2 additional examples where the TCs in one of the amendments, they noticed that in the parent standard, the normative reference was undated. So they have decided in the amendment to provide the correct date of that normative reference of the published standard. And in example 2, you can see that the parent standard included a normative reference that was withdrawn. And then this was corrected in the amendment by providing the correct date of that normative reference. So tip number 8, it is quite important that in your clause 2 and in the body of the standard, you do not refer to series of standards or you refer to all parts, even if the list is long. On the left side, you see a number of examples used in clause 2 where the TC did not provide any date. It just referred to EN 818, for example, series, and the consultant gave a lack of compliance because this is not specific enough, and that all the normative references should have been of the series, should have been listed in the standard, and also the dates should be added to those standards. So tip number 9, and this the last one. So undated references are possible under certain conditions. So the first one is if the reference is informative. So if it's not a normative reference, it's just there for information, you do not need to date that normative reference, and that reference very likely will be included in the bibliography of your standard. The second one is that if you have a normative reference that is not included in any clause of the Harmonized standard that gives presumption of conformity, in theory, you do not have to date that normative reference. If you decide to go in this direction, what you need to do is provide a very good justification so the House consultant and the Commission are immediately aware that there are a number of undated normative references, but because they are not linked with clauses giving presumption of conformity, this should not be an issue. But if you ask me, my recommendation to you would always be date everything, so you will increase your chances of citation in the official journal, which is what we all want. Now, very exceptionally, I don't recommend this at all, but I added on this slide, I was reluctant, but I have seen this in some presentation from the Commission, in some letters of the Commission, undated normative references in clauses that give presumption of conformity may be possible if you provide a well-motivated, detailed justification. However, I would really recommend that you don't do that. And the default solution should always be dated normative references. I have one slide about the parallel work with ISO and IC, just to inform you that when you develop an harmonized standard, which under Vienna Agreement, so an EN ISO standard, the same rule applies. The Commission still have the same requirements in terms of normative references. When we talk about EN ISO, the normative references list is available in clause 2. However, the default solution should always be to date the normative references. However, we also understand that there are some technical committees that they might be at ISO level that might be reluctant to date the normative references. And because we had a number of cases of these doubts and reluctancy to date the normative references at ISO level, we are discussing now with our technical board members internally solutions in order to, for example, the inclusion in the annex, in an annex of a standard, the dating of those normative references. We are also exchanging with the European Commission to see if these would be possible and acceptable from their point of view. But again, at this stage, these are just discussions. So we will update you if something is agreed and finalized. When developing EN harmonized standards that are under Frankfurt Agreement, EN-IC standard, the issue of normative references is not such of an issue because there is an Annex ZA that includes the dates of the normative references used in the standard. So there is this Annex ZA, not to be confused with the Annex ZA for CEN. It includes the corresponding of the international publications with the European publications and indicates in the body of the standard what are the dating of the normative references. And again, this Annex ZA in the case of CENELEC is normative. So to conclude the presentation, now I will touch upon this horizontal initiative, which is a checklist for harmonized standards. One of the things we've seen lately is that in the last month, we've seen an increase in the outcome, lack of compliance HAS assessment, and that's why our technical boards have decided to put in place some measures to help our technical bodies to increase and improve this HAS assessment compliance rate. So the technical boards have approved the mandatory use of a checklist that will help technical bodies in drafting harmonized standards. You have the reference of the BT decision here on the slide. In very short, this means that this horizontal checklist is applicable to all sectors except construction. So it is applicable for the machinery sector and basically includes horizontal elements to be taken into account by the technical committee when drafting harmonized standards. So there are three main principles about this checklist for harmonized standards. The first one is that when technical bodies are working on harmonized standards or harmonized standards under the Vienna Agreement, but only with CEN-lead or European Common Modifications, in the case of CENELEC, the technical bodies shall assess the compliance of those standards against this horizontal checklist. The principle number two is that the TC secretary needs to, or is responsible to make sure that the checklist is completed and submitted to CCMC together with the draft standard. And principle number three, CCMC will reject starting from 1st of October, so it's already implemented, this decision, the submission of draft harmonized standards either for inquiry or for formal vote if the checklist is not there, or if it's there, but has not been filled out. So you can find on the BOSS page, we have created new CEN-CENELEC BOSS pages with guidance on Harmonized standards. It's finally published, and you have the 2 links of these BOSS pages here. It basically covers horizontal elements, horizontal aspects, but also sectoral aspects. So on this page, you can also see some guidance material available for the machinery sector. And on these pages, you can also download the checklists for Harmonized standards that you have the print screen on the right side. Basically, the checklist contains main categories like, for example, European forward, scope, normative references, neutrality principle, Annex Set. And each of these categories have some requirements, some questions. And if they are all fulfilled, it means that the standard is probably ready to be submitted to CCMC together with this checklist for inquiry or formal vote. So again, the checklist does not impose new requirements. That's not the goal of the checklist, to impose new requirements to working groups and TCs. Is rather to help you to remind you about aspects that you need to take into account when you are drafting Harmonized standards. So here on the slide, you have the process of the checklist for Harmonized standards for both inquiry and formal vote processes in CEN. Below, what you need to know is that there is a BT decision on the matrix of responsibilities, which basically indicates who is responsible for doing what in the TC and working group in terms of Harmonized standards. On the left side, you have activities that happen in the working group. So the first is obviously that the convener and the experts are responsible for drafting the Harmonized standard. When the standard is ready, the working group qualified support checks if this draft Harmonized standard is compliant, for example, with the machinery directive, and the working group qualified support needs to ensure that the checklist is completed. Then the working group qualified support and the convener needs to submit a number of documents to the TC secretary. The first one is the draft Harmonized standard. The second one is the completed checklist. And in case of formal votes, the convener or the qualified support needs to provide as well the inquiry hazard assessment report. So it's the table of comments of the consultant. And in the last column needs to indicate how the comments from the consultant have been addressed in the standard. Then the TC secretary, when they receive these documents, they need to assess whether the checklist is there or not. So it's not the task of the TC secretary to fill this checklist. That is for the working group convener or qualified support. Then the TC secretary, if all the elements are there, submits the documents to CCMC, and CCMC will check if the Harmonized standard fulfilled certain requirements, like if the figures are correct, if the formulas are correct, but also if the checklist have been also submitted. If not, CCMC will reject the standard. If the TC secretary receives the documents from the working group that do not include the checklist, the TC secretary needs to bounce back the document, so the working group can fill the checklist, improve the draft standard if needed, and then resubmit to the TC secretary. And again, maybe I didn't explain, the working group qualified support is provided by the member holding the secretariat of the working group. So basically, each working group provides professional standardization report plus qualified support, and qualified support is to ensure that there is someone in the national standardization body in CEN to check the draft if it complies with requirements from the machinery directive, in this case, to be cited in the official journal. In CENELEC, basically, I will not go through because it's very similar, but basically there is not yet a matrix of responsibilities, but it's being prepared and it was submitted to the technical board for approval. And there is a little bit more flexibility in the working group because the tasks for the convener and they are not really well defined. So that's why it's a bit more flexible. So moving to the last slide. So these are the key learning points. The main message is that internal regulations part 3 applies on normative references, but remember that the Commission is quite strict in terms of normative references, and they are expecting that they are dated. Normative references have been for all sectors, one of the main reasons for lack of compliance assessment. So that's why there is a need to try to improve that. Therefore, as a default solution, the recommendation is to date all the normative references in your Harmonized standards. They should be dated, active, and published. I have explained that if the normative reference is not included in clauses giving presumption of conformity, there is some flexibility. You should be aware of that. However, the recommendation is to date. Be very careful when your Harmonized standard includes a normative reference that is being developed at the same time, and this could mean the same stage or different stages, and you need to really monitor the development of that normative reference to see how to tackle the last version used in your Harmonized standard. And at last, there is an horizontal checklist that contains horizontal aspects to be covered in Harmonized standards. One is about normative references, and it's mandatory already as of 1st of October. So it's applicable, this decision of the BT. So please start using, and if you have doubts about the use of normative references or on the application of the checklist, do not hesitate to come back to me or to your CCMC project manager. And this was the end of my presentation. Thank you. I haven't seen any questions yet, and I can give control also of the screen.
Thank you, Nuno, for this extensive overview. We did see some question coming in, so if you can take a look now, maybe, because of course it's not
Okay.
easy to speak and read at the same time. So please take your time to have a look now.
Yep.
I would like to remind just the audience that we will share the complete presentation that has been shown today, as well as the complete recording of the webinar via email later today.
Yes, I can answer. I will answer the question from Mr. Christian Thom about the usage of Harmonized standards checklist for parallel work under Vienna and ISO lit. I had to reduce the content of my slide, so I have removed this part, but it's a good question. Basically, it is strongly recommended also if there is EN ISO being developed at the same time with the CEN-TC to also be in touch with that ISO committee and ensure that the elements of the checklist are being considered when drafting that Harmonized standard. So we cannot force, in terms of procedures, the mandatory usage of that checklist when there is ISO lit. However, we are strongly encouraging the ISO TCs and the CEN-TCs to exchange, and also for the CEN-TC to let know the ISO, the committee manager, that it is important to use, to consider the checklist elements. So there is a question about the working group qualified support. So yes, I then answered this during the presentation. So whenever you have a working group, normally the national standardization body should provide as well the professional standardization support, and the working group qualified support is basically an additional service provided by the national standardization body to the working group in order to at the end of the process, when the draft is practically ready, to take a look at the draft and see if it fulfills the requirements of the machinery directive. Yeah, so who is the task? There is a question as well from Matthias Bailey. Whose task is to fill out the checklist? I would say that it can be the working group qualified support, or even the working group secretary or the convener. So this is something that needs to be discussed in the working group. There is some flexibility on that, but I would say that at the end, the qualified support needs to ensure that the checklist was completed. Okay, so I'm going through some questions.